Have you seen these images?
Latvia has allocated €303 million towards strengthening the border.
The Baltic states border Russia, Belarus, and a bit of Poland. But since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they are on edge. They are building the Baltic Defense Line, a network of trenches, at least 600 bunkers, obstacles, and artillery systems that are intended to slow a potential offensive operation at their border. Since 2014, they have nearly tripled their defense spending to 3.3% last year. This places the Baltics amongst the highest spenders of NATO. And while there is no reason to believe that Putin is planning anything in the region, these countries know that they stand a lot to lose. They enjoy some of the highest living standards in Eastern Europe and are approaching levels of wealth similar to that of Western Europe. But going back only until the mid-1990s, a few years after they gained independence from Russia, they had poverty levels of 38, 48, and 81% respectively. Over the past 2 decades, they saw their incomes rise faster than almost anywhere on the continent. So even though a war is extremely unlikely, with so much to lose and with such unpredictable neighbors, the Baltics decided to be prepared. But is this a solid strategy for peace, or is it another provocation towards Russia? This is the Baltic Defense Line with hindsight.
The Baltic Defense Line will be built in a coordinated manner. Each country will do so with its own budget.
The Baltic states have unique access to ports on the Baltic Sea, but they are nestled between European superpowers like Germany and Russia. One of the things that I find so interesting about the Baltic states is that their decision to strengthen their defense posture is often framed as a natural consequence of loving your country. Many of us who are living in the West have grown accustomed to the privileges of living in a highly developed society, almost to the point of entitlement. Many people feel that they own these privileges, but the Baltic states offer a much fresher perspective on what is at stake. In this video, I'm going to work towards the Baltic Defense Line, and I'm going to share why this might also be a bad idea. But let's first start with a little bit of context. The 1920s were a tumultuous time in Eastern Europe. The Baltics declared independence following the Russian Revolution, and subsequent wars with the Russians and Polish ensued. By 1922, their borders were stable. They were now independent countries, but Lithuania in particular suffered a major loss with the Polish occupation of Vilnius, their capital city, which now lay within the borders of Poland. They bordered the Soviet Union in the east and Germany in the west. Not exactly a recipe for success in the early 20th century. But the Baltics weren't doing all too bad. Their capital cities were emerging as major regional economic and industrial hubs, and they were building a strong agrarian middle class. Between 1900 and 1940, the average life expectancy in Russia was just 34 years, while the average for the Baltic states was 51 years. That's 17 years longer. Their living standards were on par with Finland or Spain, and their economy was amongst the best in Eastern Europe. But in the late 1920s, the Soviet Union was still less productive than the Baltic states, despite a recent growth spurt, and Latvia was leading the pack, but it wouldn't last. World War II had begun and the Soviets annexed the Baltic states. Poland no longer existed, and Nazi Germany was now advancing towards Moscow. This turned the Baltics into one of the front lines of their war. During and after World War II, the Russians were trying to make the Baltic states more Russian. They deported tens of thousands of people each year to work in Siberia, and in turn, they settled the region with native Russians. In the 1950s, they abolished private industries, particularly farms, and forced communist collective farming on the region. While their integration in the Soviet Union initially led to improved agricultural productivity, these collectivization policies started a persistent downhill trend. There were housing shortages, and there was widespread poverty. Food had to be rationed, and most rural villages didn't have electricity until the 1970s. Before World War II, Latvia's population was 77% Latvian, but in 1989 it had dropped to 52%, and over a third was now Russian. The same happened in Estonia, where native Estonians dropped to 62% of the population and Russians increased to 30%. But there was light at the end of the tunnel.
The Baltic peoples of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have declared their independence.
In the early 1990s, the Baltic states gained their independence, and this kickstarted one of the most epic comeback stories in modern history. The continent had now most of its modern borders, and 15 of the most economically successful countries had joined to form the European Union. The average GDP per capita of these countries was $26,000 in 1995, while the Baltic states' GDP was 10 times lower at $2,500. In 2004, they were among a handful of Eastern European countries that joined the alliance, and this was a game changer. This opened the doors to apply for funding and to export products to some of the richest customers in the world. The total value of their international trade increased substantially, and especially for Lithuania. They positioned themselves as a trade hub from goods from Russia and Belarus into the European Union, as well as a transport hub from Russia to their exclave on the Baltic Sea. Free markets, privatized industries, investments in education, technology, and digital infrastructure all helped these countries transform dramatically over time. Their GDP per capita used to be 10 times lower than the average of the 15 original EU members. Now it's about half, which means they still have a long way to go, but it's also almost twice that of Russia's. Frankly, no matter how you look at it, they are now better off than in the 1990s. Estonia's productivity, the richest of the three, is similar to that of Spain. Latvia's output is the lowest, but they are still on par with Poland and Hungary. Poverty rates, defined as living on less than $8.30 per day in 2021 money, dropped from 40 to 80% to less than 3% in all these countries. Wouldn't you be willing to put up a fight to protect this kind of prosperity?
War has returned to Europe.
The 3 fighter jets violated Estonia's airspace.
In the forests of northern Estonia, war games are underway.
The Baltic states joined EU and NATO, and this firmly positioned them as allies of the West. But this kind of political and military expansion was one of the justifications that Putin used for his aggression in Ukraine. It makes sense given their history with Russia that they wanted some guarantees. They are at the geographic and political frontline of the escalating tensions in Europe. But their decision to now fortify the border, to pick up arms and to show strength, is that actually the best way to dissuade Russia from pursuing any military action in the future? Or could it perhaps be interpreted as a provocation?
20,000 Russian soldiers have been on the move across Crimea in the past 24 hours.
When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, all alarms went off in the Baltic states. Some of the rhetoric that Putin used to justify his decisions could in some light also apply to the Baltic states. Their immediate response was to invest in their military. After the global financial crisis, Latvia and Lithuania had lowered their defense spending to ease some of the economic pressures, but also because the threat of Russia wasn't perceived as anything urgent. But Russia's annexation of Crimea changed all of this, and both countries started catching up again with Estonia. But while this was a wake-up call, there was still hope that it would end here. Lithuania was still an important trade hub for goods traveling from Russia to this Russian exclave, Kaliningrad, which is home to nearly 500,000 Russians. They are almost entirely dependent on imported foods and goods, and most of this travels by rail through Lithuania, which is a profitable business. Crimea's annexation didn't trigger a drop in trade between Russia and the Baltics, but now reality has sunk in. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine changed everything. It showed how far Putin was willing to go and that within Ukraine, no options were off the table.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine prompted Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia and Poland to bolster their defenses and strengthen their borders.
Estonia's new defense plan includes bunkers, anti-tank mines and trenches.
The Baltic response this time was much stronger. Their military spending increased from 2 to well over 3%, and this time they did substantially lower trade. It is now a fraction of what it was in the early 2010s.
A blockade on goods transiting through Lithuania to the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad.
The Kremlin has accused Lithuania of hostile actions.
These aren't short-lived sanctions. These changes represent a different attitude towards having Putin's Russia as a neighbor. Together with a handful of other countries, they left treaties that banned the use of anti-personnel mines. They started rearming, buying ammunition, anti-drone and tank systems, and they agreed on building the much-hyped Baltic defense line. In their collective defense, they focus on their border with Russia, as well as Belarus. But even this border with Poland is a potential security risk. This is their only land connection with NATO Europe, and it will likely be a first target for divisions in Kaliningrad if Russia were to ever launch an offensive operation. They are building networks of obstacles, fortifications, and supportive infrastructure like storage points for ammunition, with the goal to slow a potential advance into their countries. Their capital cities aren't far from the border. In the case of Lithuania, just 30 kilometers or 18 miles. For Latvia and Estonia, it's anywhere between 150 and 200 kilometers, 90 to 120 miles. The relatively small size of their countries makes them more vulnerable than Ukraine, and with these trenches, anti-tank ditches, and obstacles like these dragon's teeth, they hope to slow an offensive and buy some time. But would this really be enough? The 3 Baltic states currently have less than 50,000 active soldiers compared to 1.5 million in Russia. Ukraine has nearly 900,000 soldiers. An attack from Russia, however unlikely, would drag Russia into a direct conflict with NATO, and the Baltics would likely suffer tremendous blows. The alternative would be to de-escalate, put down your arms, lower defense budgets, and maybe leave NATO's alliance. This is what Putin wants. But what many people forget is this. NATO's defense budgets have decreased substantially since the breakup of the Soviet Union, despite more members joining the alliance over that same period. That trend was reversed after Russia's annexation of Crimea. The NATO alliance grew, which can be interpreted as an escalation, but their collective budgets significantly decreased, which could be interpreted as a de-escalation. Would the Baltics be safer if they left the alliance and lowered defense budgets? Or would they be safer if they respond to strength with strength? So right now there isn't any statistic that I can show to provide some insight in what might be the best decision, because in the end this is a policy preference. But the governments of the Baltic states have chosen the latter. Because of their newfound prosperity, imagine if Putin does change his mind and makes a move. How would you justify not being ready after all that has happened in the past? Hey, so just really quickly before you go, if you want to support my work, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps a lot more than you may think. We put a lot of effort and time and money into making these videos, and some of them scale and some never really reach an audience. And one of the things that I identified is that the videos that don't really perform that well don't receive a lot of positive engagement, and particularly in that first week after uploading. So if you want to help me make these videos more frequently and to make them better, please consider engaging positively with them. And now, after that, you can consider these 2 videos for your next watch.